The stagecoach lurched violently as its wheel struck another rut in the dusty road, and Adelaide Dawson clutched her sewing basket tighter against her chest, watching the Wyoming Territory landscape roll past through the begrimed window. It was late spring in 1878, and she had been traveling for 3 days from Cheyenne, heading toward Snake River, Idaho, where a merchant had promised her steady work as a seamstress in his new dry goods store. The promise of employment and a fresh start had been enough to make her leave behind the boarding house where she had spent the last 2 years mending clothes for miners and their families, saving every penny for this opportunity. Adelaide was 23 years old, unmarried, and fiercely independent in a world that expected women to be neither. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun beneath a simple gray bonnet, and her traveling dress, though well made by her own skilled hands, showed the wear of someone who worked hard for every dollar. The fabric of her life had been woven with loss and determination in equal measure. Her parents had died of cholera when she was 16, leaving her with nothing but a sewing basket, her mother's silver thimble, and the skills to make her own way in the world. The other passengers in the coach were a portly banker who snored against the opposite window and an older woman who had spent most of the journey reading from a small leather Bible. Adelaide preferred the silence. It gave her time to think about what awaited her in Snake River, to imagine the shop where she would work, the little room she would rent, the life she would build stitch by careful stitch. The stage driver's shout came sudden and sharp. The horses whinnied in alarm, and the coach jerked to an abrupt halt that sent Adelaide's basket tumbling to the floor, spilling spools of thread that rolled across the dusty boards. She heard voices outside, tense and urgent, and then the door was yanked open by a man whose face was covered with a dirty bandana. "Everyone out," he barked, gesturing with a revolver that looked too large for his trembling hand. "Now." Adelaide's heart hammered against her ribs as she gathered her scattered belongings with shaking hands. The banker was awake now, sputtering protests that died in his throat when the gunman cocked his weapon. The older woman clutched her Bible and began to pray in a whispered rush of words. Adelaide climbed down from the coach on unsteady legs, her sewing basket clutched against her side. There were 3 of them in total. The one who had opened the door, a taller man holding the reins of the stage horses, and a third rifling through the strong box that had been secured to the roof. They were young, Adelaide realized with a start, probably no older than 20, with the desperate look of men who had not thought through what they were doing. "Money and valuables," the tall one demanded, moving down the line of passengers. "Hand them over and nobody gets hurt." The banker fumbled with his wallet, his face gone purple with indignation or fear or both. The older woman surrendered a small coin purse with trembling fingers. Then the robber stood before Adelaide, his eyes hard above the bandana covering his lower face. "Well," he said. "I have $17, Adelaide said, her voice steadier than she felt. "It is everything I own in this world, and I need it to start my life in Snake River. If you take it, you leave me with nothing." "That is generally how robbery works, lady," the man said, but there was uncertainty in his tone now. "Hand it over." Adelaide reached into the pocket sewn into her skirt and withdrew the small cloth purse that contained her savings. Her fingers closed around it for one last moment, feeling the weight of all those hours of work, all those careful calculations and denied comforts. Then a voice rang out across the empty landscape, clear and commanding. "I would reconsider that if I were you." Everyone turned. A rider approached from the east, silhouetted against the afternoon sun so that at first he was nothing more than a dark shape on horseback. As he drew closer, Adelaide could make out more details. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle, wearing worn leather chaps over denim trousers, a dark vest over a blue shirt, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. A revolver hung at his hip, and he carried a rifle in one hand, though it was not yet pointed at anyone. "This does not concern you, friend," the tall robber called out, trying to sound threatening. "Keep riding." "Cannot do that," the cowboy said, his horse coming to a stop about 20 feet away. "This stage runs through Elkhorn Ranch land, which means these folks are under our protection whether they know it or not. Boss gets particular about people feeling safe when they cross our territory. There are 3 of us and 1 of you," the man searching the strongbox said, climbing down with a small bag that clinked with coins. "Odds are not in your favor." The cowboy shifted in his saddle, and Adelaide saw his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with sun-darkened skin and a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His eyes were a startling blue-green, like creek water in summer, and they moved with calm assessment over the scene before him. "That is true," he acknowledged. "But I have been shooting since I was 8 years old, and I can hit a target at 300 yards. How about you boys? You look like you have been holding those guns for maybe a week." He paused, letting that sink in. "Also, I am not alone. Look behind you." The robbers spun around. On the ridge to the west, 3 more riders had appeared, spread out in a line, watching and waiting. Adelaide did not know if they had been there all along or had just arrived, but the effect was immediate. The 3 young men exchanged glances, their bravado crumbling like sun-dried mud. "Leave the strongbox and whatever you took from these passengers," the cowboy said, his voice still conversational but edged with steel. "Get on your horses and ride south. If I see you on Elkhorn land again, I will not be so generous with my warnings." There was a moment when it could have gone either way, a held breath where Adelaide wondered if these desperate boys would choose pride over sense. Then the tall one cursed, threw the small bag he had been holding onto the ground, and stalked toward the horses tied nearby. The other 2 followed, mounting up in awkward haste. Within moments, they were riding away at a gallop, leaving a trail of dust hanging in the still air. The cowboy waited until they were out of sight before dismounting. He picked up the bag of coins and the strongbox, then approached the stage driver, who had been sitting frozen on his bench throughout the entire encounter. "You all right, Charlie?" he asked. "Damn grateful to see you, Russell," the driver said, his voice shaky as he accepted the strongbox. "Thought we were done for certain." "Russell." Adelaide filed the name away as she watched him return the coin purse to the older woman and the wallet to the banker. Then he turned to Adelaide, and she found herself looking directly into those remarkable eyes. "You did not get a chance to hand yours over," he said, and she realized she was still clutching her cloth purse in one white-knuckled fist. "That was either very brave or very foolish, telling them it was all you had." "It was the truth," Adelaide said, "though I suppose it was foolish as well." Truth and foolishness are not mutually exclusive. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "No, I suppose they are not." He glanced at the basket she held, at the spools of thread visible inside. "You are a seamstress." "I am. Adelaide Dawson. I am traveling to Snake River to work in a dry goods store there." "Russell Everett," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both polite and somehow old-fashioned. "I work for Elkhorn Ranch, about 5 miles east of here. We run cattle and horses, mostly." The stage driver cleared his throat. "We should get moving if we want to make Snake River before dark. Russell, you riding escort the rest of the way. I will follow behind for a spell. Make sure those boys do not circle back with reinforced courage," Russell said. He looked at Adelaide again, and she felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest. "Safe travels, Miss Dawson. Welcome to Idaho territory." Then he was mounting his horse in one fluid motion, and Adelaide was being ushered back into the coach by the impatient banker. She settled onto the worn seat and watched through the window as Russell Everett turned his horse and trotted back the way he had come, signaling to the riders on the ridge. The stage lurched into motion once more, wheels creaking and harness jingling, carrying her toward her new life. But Adelaide found she could not stop thinking about the cowboy with the summer water eyes who had appeared like something out of a dime novel. All quiet confidence and easy capability. She pressed her hand against her pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of her savings still safe, and wondered if she would ever see Russell Everett again. The thought that she might not left her with an unexpected sense of loss, which was ridiculous because she had known the man for all of 10 minutes. Adelaide shook her head at her own foolishness and tried to focus on the landscape rolling past, on the future waiting for her in Snake River, on anything except the memory of how Russell had looked at her with something that might have been recognition, as if he had been expecting her all along. Snake River turned out to be exactly what Adelaide had imagined, and nothing like it at the same time. The town sat in a valley where the Snake River curved through basalt cliffs, a collection of wooden buildings that looked both permanent and temporary, as if the town could not quite decide whether it was settling in for the long haul or just passing through. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with establishments that serviced the ranchers, miners, and travelers who passed through this part of Idaho territory. A general store, a saloon, a hotel, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and the small church that probably also served as the schoolhouse. The dry goods store where Adelaide was to work sat between the hotel and a building with a sign that read, "Dr. Morrison, Physician and Dentist." It was a neat structure with a false front that made it look taller than it was, and through the window Adelaide could see bolts of fabric, household goods, and the kind of practical merchandise that frontier life required. The proprietor, Mr. Wallace, was a thin man with spectacles and a nervous manner who seemed both relieved and anxious at Adelaide's arrival. He showed her the back room where she would work, a space with good light from a large window and a solid table where she could spread out her materials. Her duties would include mending, alterations, making curtains and clothing to order, and helping in the store when needed. The pay was modest but fair, and he offered her a room above the shop at a reasonable rate. "You will find Snake River a decent place," Mr. Wallace said, his hands fidgeting with a pencil. "We have law and order mostly. Marshal Brennan keeps things civilized. There's a community here, families settling in. People need someone with your skills." Adelaide settled into her new life with determined efficiency. She unpacked her few belongings in the small room above the shop, arranged her sewing supplies in the workroom downstairs, and began taking in projects. Word spread quickly that a skilled seamstress had arrived, and within days she had a steady stream of customers. Ranch wives needing dresses let out or taken in, miners wanting shirts and trousers mended, mothers commissioning christening gowns and school clothes for their children. The work was familiar and soothing. Adelaide lost herself in the rhythm of needle and thread, in the satisfaction of transforming worn fabric into something renewed, of creating beauty and function with her own two hands. She fell asleep each night with her fingers aching pleasantly, feeling that she had earned her place in this town one stitch at a time. But she could not stop thinking about Russell Everett. It was absurd and she knew it, yet he lingered in her mind like a half-remembered song. She found herself watching the street through the shop window, looking for a familiar figure on horseback, telling herself She was merely curious about her rescuer, while knowing it was something more than that. 2 weeks passed. Adelaide learned the rhythms of Snake River, the faces of its inhabitants, the way the town seemed to hold its breath in the heat of afternoon and come alive again as evening approached. She learned that Mrs. Chen, who ran the boarding house, made the best dumplings west of San Francisco, that the blacksmith's daughter was getting married in July and would need a wedding dress, that Marshal Brennan had once been a Texas Ranger and still carried himself with that particular blend of courtesy and coiled danger. On a Thursday afternoon, Adelaide was finishing a christening gown for a rancher's wife, working tiny white stitches into delicate cotton when the bell above the shop door chimed. She looked up and felt her heart perform an acrobatic maneuver that would have been alarming if it had not been so exhilarating. Russell Everett stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking somehow both at ease and uncertain. He was cleaner than he had been on the road, freshly shaved, wearing a shirt that looked recently pressed. His eyes found her immediately, and something in his expression made Adelaide forget how to breathe properly. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all," Adelaide managed, setting down her needle before she could stab herself with it. "Mr. Everett, what brings you to town? Supplies, mostly. We come in every couple of weeks." He stepped further into the shop, and Adelaide noticed he was carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "But I also wanted to check that you made it here safely, that you are settling in well." "That is kind of you," Adelaide said, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "I am settling in very well, thanks in part to your intervention on the road. I never properly thanked you for that." "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "I do not think that is true, but it is gracious of you to say." Adelaide stood, brushing threads from her skirt. "Is there something I can help you with? Do you need mending done?" Russell looked down at the package in his hands, then back at her, and Adelaide saw a hint of color rise in his tanned cheeks. "Actually, I brought you something. It is probably foolish, but when I saw it, I thought of you, and I bought it before I could talk myself out of it." He held out the package. "You do not have to accept it if it is not appropriate. I do not want to presume anything." Adelaide took the package with trembling fingers, aware that Mr. Wallace was watching with undisguised curiosity from behind the counter. She unwrapped the paper carefully and caught her breath. Inside was a length of fabric unlike anything in the shop's inventory, a deep blue cotton with tiny white flowers printed on it, fine quality and beautiful. The merchant said it came all the way from St. Louis, Russell said, his words coming faster now as if he needed to explain. "I know you work with fabric all day, so maybe this is like giving hay to a rancher, but I thought you might want something for yourself. You said that money was everything you had, and I thought maybe you have been spending it all on necessities, and everyone deserves something that is just beautiful, not practical." Adelaide looked up at him, this cowboy who had saved her from robbery and then thought to bring her a gift of impractical beauty, and felt something shift and settle in her chest like a puzzle piece finding its proper place. "It is the loveliest thing anyone has ever given me," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Thank you, Russell, truly." His smile transformed his face, made him look younger and more open. "I am glad you like it." "Listen, Miss Dawson, Adelaide, if I may, I wonder if you might allow me to call on you properly. I know you are new to town and probably have 100 things to do, but I would like to get to know you better, if you would be amenable to that." "I would like that very much," Adelaide said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. And so it began. Russell came to town every few days, always with some excuse, supplies or business that needed attending, but always finding his way to the dry goods store, to the back room where Adelaide worked her magic with needle and thread. He would sit on the stool near her workbench, and they would talk about everything and nothing, about their lives and dreams and the small details that make up a person's history. Adelaide learned that Russell had come west from Missouri when he was 15, following an older brother who had died in a mining accident before Russell ever arrived. With no family to return to and no money for passage, even if he had wanted to go back, Russell had hired on at Elkhorn Ranch and worked his way up from stable hand to ranch hand to the position he held now, which was something between foreman and partner, a trusted man who had proven his worth 1,000 times over. "The boss, Mr. Patterson, he has been good to me," Russell said one afternoon, watching Adelaide's hands move surely through a complicated seam. "He saw something in me, I guess, gave me opportunities to prove myself. The ranch is doing well. We have good water, good grazing. Last year we drove 200 head to market and turned a solid profit." "You love it," Adelaide observed. "The work, the land." "I do," Russell admitted. "It is hard and sometimes dangerous, but there is something about it. Building something that lasts, being part of something bigger than yourself. Does that make sense?" "It does," Adelaide said, thinking of how she felt when she completed a particularly challenging piece of sewing, when she transformed raw material into something functional and beautiful. "I think we are not so different, you and I. We both make our living with our hands, creating and tending and fixing." Russell smiled at that, and Adelaide felt the now familiar flutter in her chest. She was falling for him, she knew, falling hard and fast in a way that should have frightened her, but instead felt like the most natural thing in the world. He was kind and strong and thoughtful, steady as the earth and surprising as summer rain. When he looked at her, she felt seen in a way she had never experienced before, as if he understood not just who she was but who she could be. Russell learned that Adelaide had grown up in St. Louis, daughter of a clerk and a music teacher, that she had loved learning and reading, and had once dreamed of becoming a teacher herself before her parents' death had redirected her life. She told him about those hard years after, about learning to survive on her own, about the loneliness and the determination that had carried her through. "You are remarkable," Russell said quietly, and Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes because he said it like he meant it, like it was simply a fact. "What you have done, what you have made of yourself, it takes a special kind of courage." "Or a special kind of stubbornness," Adelaide said, trying to lighten the moment before she dissolved into embarrassing tears. "Those are often the same thing," Russell replied, and the understanding in his eyes made Adelaide's heart ache with something that was equal parts joy and terror. Their courtship, if that was what to call it, unfolded through the long days of summer. Russell began timing his trips to town to coincide with Adelaide's half-day off on Sundays. They would walk along the river, talking and laughing, or sit on the bench outside the church and watch the town go about its business. Russell brought her wildflowers picked from the rangeland, bunches of Indian paintbrush and lupine that Adelaide would arrange in a jar on her windowsill. Adelaide sewed him a new shirt, working the fabric from his gift into a vest that brought out the color of his eyes. The town noticed, of course. Snake River was too small for anything to go unremarked, and Adelaide found herself the subject of speculative looks and knowing smiles. Mrs. Chen declared that Russell was a good man, a steady man, and several of Adelaide's customers made pointed comments about how fortunate she was. Even Mr. Wallace seemed pleased, though Adelaide suspected that had more to do with her improved mood making her easier to work with than any romantic sentiment on his part. But it was not all smooth progress. There were obstacles, both practical and emotional. Russell's work kept him at the ranch for days at a time, and Adelaide's responsibilities in the shop meant she could not simply disappear whenever he came to town. They were building something between them, but it was fragile and uncertain, complicated by the realities of their separate lives. One evening in late July, after a particularly long day of work, Russell and Adelaide sat by the river as the sun set in layers of orange and pink. The air had finally cooled from the brutal heat of afternoon, and the sound of the water moving over stones was soothing and constant. "I have been thinking," Russell said, his voice careful, "about the future, about what I want." Adelaide's heart began to beat faster. "And what do you want, Russell?" He turned to face her, and in the fading light his eyes were serious and full of something that made Adelaide's breath catch. "I want you," he said simply. "I want a life with you, a home, a family. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are beside me and fall asleep every night the same way. I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but Adelaide, I have never been more certain of anything in my life." Adelaide felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "I want that too," she whispered. "I want it so much it frightens me." Russell reached out and gently wiped the tears from her face with his thumb. "Why does it frighten you?" "Because wanting something this much means it can be taken away," Adelaide said, all her fears spilling out. "Because I have built my life on being independent, on not needing anyone, and now I find I need you desperately, and I do not know what to do with that." "You do not have to do anything with it except let it be," Russell said. "I am not going anywhere, Adelaide. I am right here, and I am asking you to stitch your life together with mine, to make something new that is both of us and more than either of us alone." The metaphor was so perfect, so exactly right, that Adelaide laughed through her tears. "Did you practice that speech?" "Maybe a little," Russell admitted with a crooked smile. "Did it work?" "Yes," Adelaide said and kissed him for the first time, a soft, sweet press of lips that tasted like possibility and promise. "Yes, Russell, I will stitch my life with yours. I cannot imagine doing anything else." But of course, life was never that simple. Russell had spoken truly when he said he wanted a life with Adelaide, but the practical details of how to build that life proved more complicated than the emotional declaration. Adelaide had her work in town, a position she could not simply abandon without leaving Mr. Wallace in a difficult situation. Russell had his responsibilities at the ranch, obligations to Mr. Patterson, who had invested years in training him. They were building something together, but the foundation kept shifting beneath their feet. "Come to the ranch," Russell said one Sunday afternoon, several weeks after their conversation by the river. "Not to live, not yet, but just to see it. I want you to understand what my life there looks like, what I am asking you to be part of." Adelaide agreed, and the following Saturday she borrowed a horse from the livery and rode out with Russell through the rolling rangeland toward Elkhorn Ranch. The landscape was beautiful in a spare, dramatic way, all golden grass and distant mountains, sky so blue it seemed impossible. They rode side by side, Russell pointing out landmarks and telling stories, and Adelaide felt something in her chest expand and settle, as if her heart were getting used to having more room to grow. Elkhorn Ranch sat in a valley where a creek fed into the Snake River, creating rich grazing land that supported hundreds of cattle and horses. The main house was a sturdy log structure with a wide porch, surrounded by barns and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. Mr. Patterson turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and his wife Martha was a round, cheerful woman who welcomed Adelaide with genuine warmth. "Russell has spoken of nothing but you for weeks," Martha Patterson said, leading Adelaide into the house while Russell and her husband went to check on something in the barn. It is good to see him happy. He has been alone too long, that boy, working too hard and giving too little thought to his own happiness. The house was comfortable and well kept, full of the kind of details that spoke of a woman's touch: curtains on the windows, a quilt on the sofa, wildflowers in a vase on the table. Martha showed Adelaide around with obvious pride, and Adelaide found herself imagining what it would be like to live in such a place, to be part of this world of wide horizons and honest work. "Russell has a cabin of his own," Martha said, gesturing toward a smaller building visible through the window. "Mr. Patterson built it for him last year, recognition of his partnership in the ranch. It is just one room right now, but Russell has plans to add on to make it into a proper house. He has been working on it himself whenever he has spare time, which is not often enough." Adelaide looked at the cabin, small and neat with a stone chimney, and felt a wave of emotion so strong it nearly knocked her over. Russell was building a home, a place for the life he had described to her by the river. He was working toward their future with the same steady determination he brought to everything else. Russell found her there, standing at the window, and came to stand beside her. "What do you think?" "I think you have built something beautiful here," Adelaide said. "I think I can see why you love it." "But can you see yourself here?" Russell asked, and there was vulnerability in the question, a need for reassurance that made Adelaide love him even more. She turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. "I can see myself anywhere you are," she said. "But Russell, I need time. I have responsibilities in town, commitments I made. I cannot just abandon them." "I would never ask you to," Russell said firmly. "We will figure it out, Adelaide, together. There is no rush, no deadline. I just needed you to see this, to know what I am working toward." They stayed for dinner, eating Martha's excellent cooking and talking with the Pattersons about ranching and town gossip and the approaching harvest. Adelaide felt herself relaxing into the conversation, appreciating the easy warmth of the couple and the way Russell became even more himself in this place that was clearly home to him. When they finally rode back to Snake River under a sky brilliant with stars, Adelaide felt as if something had been settled between them, some unspoken question answered. The late summer days blurred together in a haze of work and stolen moments with Russell. Adelaide's reputation as a seamstress grew, and she found herself with more commissions than she could easily manage. She made the wedding dress for the blacksmith's daughter, a confection of white cotton and lace that made the girl cry with happiness. She sewed shirts for the ranch hands, curtains for the hotel, a suit for the banker who had been on the stage with her that day back in June. Russell came to town whenever he could, and they carved out time together however they could manage it. Sometimes it was just a few minutes in the shop, Russell leaning against her workbench and watching her sew while they talked about their days. Sometimes it was a proper outing, a picnic by the river or a walk through town in the evening. Always there was the awareness between them, the growing certainty that they were building toward something permanent and real. In late August, Adelaide received a letter that changed everything. It was from a lawyer in St. Louis, informing her that a distant aunt she had barely known had died and left Adelaide a small inheritance. Not a fortune, but enough to provide a meaningful cushion of security. The news was bittersweet. Adelaide had not known her aunt well enough to mourn her deeply, but the gesture of remembrance touched her nonetheless. More importantly, the inheritance gave Adelaide options. She could continue working for Mr. Wallace if she chose, or she could strike out on her own, perhaps opening her own seamstress shop. Or she could make other choices, choices that involved a cabin on a ranch, and a man with summer water eyes who had stolen her heart with his quiet steadiness and genuine kindness. Adelaide sat in her room above the shop, the lawyer's letter in her hands, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had left Cheyenne seeking independence and security, seeking to build a life on her own terms. She had found those things in Snake River, but she had also found something unexpected and infinitely more precious. She had found a man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw, who valued her strength and understood her fears, who wanted to build a life with her that honored both their dreams. The decision, when she finally made it, felt both terrifying and inevitable. Adelaide went to Mr. Wallace the next morning and gave him 3 months' notice, enough time for him to find and train a replacement. He was disappointed but not surprised, and he thanked her for her consideration in giving him time to adjust. "You are doing the right thing," Mr. Wallace said, fidgeting with his spectacles. "Russell Everett is a good man, and love like what you two have found does not come along every day. You should grab it with both hands and hold on tight." Adelaide found Russell at the livery stable, where he was arranging for feed deliveries to the ranch. When he saw her expression, something in his face changed, became both hopeful and cautious, as if he was afraid to believe what he saw there. "Walk with me," Adelaide asked, and Russell followed her without question to their spot by the river, where the water sang its constant song and the afternoon light turned everything golden. "I have made a decision," Adelaide said, facing him with her heart in her throat. "I have given Mr. Wallace my notice. In 3 months I will be free of my obligations there." Russell's eyes widened. "Adelaide, what are you saying?" "I am saying yes," Adelaide said, her voice growing stronger with certainty. "Yes to stitching my life with yours. Yes to the ranch and the cabin and the future we talked about. Yes to taking a chance on something that frightens me because it matters so much. Yes to you, Russell. Always yes to you." Russell let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled Adelaide into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You are sure?" he asked against her hair. "You are absolutely certain, because once you say yes, I am never letting you go." "I have never been more certain of anything," Adelaide said, pulling back enough to look into his face. "I love you, Russell Everett. I love you, and I want to marry you and build a life with you, and I cannot wait another moment to tell you that." "I love you too," Russell said, and kissed her with such joy and passion that Adelaide forgot where she was, forgot everything except the feel of his arms around her and the perfect rightness of this moment. "Marry me, Adelaide. Marry me as soon as we can arrange it. I have waited my whole life to find you, and I do not want to waste another day." They were married in September, on a Sunday afternoon when the aspens on the mountainsides had turned gold, and the air carried the first hint of autumn's bite. The ceremony took place in the little church in Snake River, with Marshal Brennan giving Adelaide away and half the town crowding into the pews. Adelaide wore a dress she had sewn herself from Russell's blue fabric, fitted and beautiful, with tiny white flowers like a summer meadow. Russell wore the vest she had made him and a new shirt, and when he saw her walking down the aisle, his face transformed with such open emotion that several people in the congregation had to wipe their eyes. The vows were simple and traditional, but when Russell slipped a gold band onto Adelaide's finger and promised to love and cherish her for all his days, Adelaide felt the words settle into her bones like a blessing. She made her own promises in return, her voice clear and sure, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Russell kissed her with such tenderness that Adelaide felt tears slip down her cheeks. The reception was held at the hotel, a boisterous affair with food and music and dancing that lasted well into the evening. The Pattersons had come from the ranch, along with a dozen hands who treated Russell like a brother and welcomed Adelaide with rowdy good humor. Mr. Wallace gave them a set of dishes as a wedding present. Mrs. Chen contributed a beautiful embroidered tablecloth. The blacksmith's daughter, radiant in the dress Adelaide had made her, sang a song that made everyone cry. But the best moment came late in the evening, when Russell and Adelaide finally slipped away from the celebration and rode out to the ranch under a sky thick with stars. They rode slowly, hands clasped between their horses, talking quietly about the day and the life that stretched before them. When they finally reached the cabin that was now their home, Russell lifted Adelaide down from her horse and carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the unnecessary gallantry of it. The cabin was small but welcoming, lit by candles that Martha Patterson must have arranged earlier. There was a bed in one corner, a stove in another, a table and chairs and the beginnings of a home. Russell set Adelaide down gently and looked at her with such love that she felt her heart might burst with the fullness of it. "Are you happy?" he asked, taking her hands in his. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Adelaide said, and drew him down for a kiss that tasted like promise and passion and the beginning of forever. Their wedding night was tender and awkward and wonderful, a fumbling discovery of each other that was made beautiful by the love that suffused every touch. Russell was gentle and patient, attentive to Adelaide's responses, and Adelaide gave herself to him without reservation, trusting him completely. They learned each other slowly, with laughter and whispered words and the kind of intimacy that goes deeper than mere physical connection. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Adelaide's head on Russell's chest and his arms around her, listening to each other breathe. Through the window, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Adelaide thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the stage robbery and the cowboy who had appeared like fate made manifest, about all the small choices and chances that had led to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Russell asked, his voice a rumble beneath her ear. "That I was traveling to Snake River looking for a new life," Adelaide said. "And I found so much more than I ever expected. I found home. I found you." Russell tightened his arms around her. "I was just existing before you came along," he said quietly. "Working and surviving but not really living. You changed everything, Adelaide. You made me want things I did not even know I was missing." "We saved each other," Adelaide said, and knew it was true. "We stitched our broken pieces together and made something whole." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Adelaide's last conscious thought was that she was exactly where she belonged, that every hard road and difficult choice had been leading her here, to this man, to this life, to this perfect and hard-won happiness. The first months of married life were an adjustment for both of them. Adelaide had been independent for so long that learning to share her space and her decisions required conscious effort. Russell, used to the bachelor habits of ranch life, had to remember that someone else's needs and preferences now mattered as much as his own. But they worked at it with the same determination they brought to everything else, and gradually the rough edges smoothed out and they found their rhythm. Adelaide set up a sewing corner in the cabin, near the window where the light was best, and continued to take in projects from town. She rode into Snake River twice a week, carrying finished work and collecting new commissions, maintaining the relationships she had built and the reputation she had earned. The income was modest but meaningful, and more importantly, the work gave Adelaide a sense of purpose and identity beyond being Russell's wife. Russell threw himself into improving the cabin, working evenings and Sundays to add a second room, to build proper furniture, to make their home more comfortable. He consulted Adelaide on every decision, valuing her opinions on placement and design, making sure the house they were building together reflected both their tastes and needs. Adelaide watched him work, this strong, capable man who had chosen to share his life with her, and felt gratitude and love in equal measure. The ranch work was hard and unpredictable. Russell was gone long hours, sometimes entire days when the cattle needed moving or fences needed mending or any of the 1,000 tasks that kept a ranch running. Adelaide learned to manage her worry, to trust in Russell's competence and experience, to accept that this was the life they had chosen together. She filled the lonely hours with sewing and reading, with befriending Martha Patterson and learning the skills of ranch life, with slowly transforming the cabin into a home that spoke of permanence and care. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains in November with snow and wind that turned the landscape into a study in white and gray. The ranch work slowed but did not stop. The animals still needed tending, the buildings required constant maintenance, and the cold added layers of difficulty to every task. Russell came home each night exhausted and half frozen, and Adelaide learned to have hot water ready for washing and hot food ready for eating, to warm his cold hands between her own and remind him with kisses and whispers that he had someone waiting who cared about his comfort. Christmas was quiet but joyful, just the two of them in their cabin with a small pine tree Russell had cut from the foothills and a feast Adelaide had prepared with Martha's coaching. They exchanged simple gifts. Adelaide had sewn Russell a heavy coat lined with sheepskin, and Russell gave her a carved wooden box he had made for storing her sewing supplies. Each joint fitted perfectly, each surface sanded smooth. They went to bed early, making love slowly in the warmth of their bed while the wind howled outside, creating their own heat and light against the winter darkness. In January, Adelaide realized she was pregnant. The signs had been there for weeks, but she had been reluctant to hope, afraid of disappointment. When she finally allowed herself to believe it, she felt a rush of emotion so complex she could not name all its components. Joy and terror, excitement and anxiety, wonder and worry all tangled together. She told Russell that evening, watching his face carefully to gauge his reaction. For a moment he just stared at her, as if the words had been in a foreign language he needed time to translate. Then his face broke into the widest smile Adelaide had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably carried all the way to the main house. "A baby," he said, picking Adelaide up and spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "We are going to have a baby. Adelaide, do you realize what this means? We are going to be parents. We are going to have a family." "I am terrified," Adelaide admitted once Russell had set her down. "I know nothing about babies or being a mother. What if I do everything wrong?" "Then we will do it wrong together," Russell said, cupping her face in his hands. "Adelaide, you are the strongest, most capable person I know. You will be an amazing mother. And I will be right beside you every step of the way, probably making just as many mistakes, and we will figure it out together the way we figure out everything." His confidence was infectious, and Adelaide felt her anxiety ease slightly. They would do this together, just like he said. They would stitch this new life into the pattern they had created, and it would be challenging and frightening and wonderful. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the late winter and into spring. Adelaide's body changed and expanded, her dresses requiring constant alteration as her belly grew. She continued her sewing work as long as she could manage it, though by late spring she had to reduce her commissions because sitting for long hours had become uncomfortable. Russell became impossibly protective, worrying over every twinge and discomfort, driving Adelaide to fond exasperation with his constant concern. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him one afternoon when he tried to stop her from carrying a basket of laundry. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I promise I will tell you if I need help." But secretly, Adelaide loved his attentiveness, loved knowing that he cared so deeply about her well-being and that of their child. She loved watching him work on the addition to the cabin, creating a space that would be the nursery, building a cradle with his own hands from smooth pine, carving tiny flowers into the headboard that echoed the fabric of her wedding dress. Martha Patterson became Adelaide's anchor during those months, sharing wisdom from her own experiences raising children, offering practical advice and emotional support. The two women had become close friends, and Adelaide was grateful for Martha's presence in her life, for having another woman to talk to about the fears and hopes that came with impending motherhood. The baby came in late July, born during a thunderstorm that rattled the windows and turned the world outside into sheets of rain. Adelaide's labor was long and hard, attended by Mrs. Chen, who had experience as a midwife, and Martha, who held Adelaide's hand and murmured encouragement through every contraction. Russell paced outside, helpless and frantic, until finally, as dawn was breaking and the storm was clearing, the baby's cry split the air and Adelaide collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and elated. "A boy," Mrs. Chen announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a soft blanket Adelaide had sewn months ago. "A healthy, strong boy with good lungs." They let Russell in then, and Adelaide would never forget the expression on his face when he saw his son for the first time. He approached the bed slowly, reverently, as if afraid he might break the spell, and when Adelaide placed the baby in his arms, Russell looked down at the tiny red face with such pure wonder that tears slipped unheeded down his cheeks. "He is perfect," Russell whispered. "Adelaide, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Robert, after Russell's father whom he barely remembered, and called him Robbie from the start. The baby had Russell's strong features and Adelaide's dark hair, and from the beginning he was a good-natured child, crying only when hungry or uncomfortable and settling easily when held and soothed. The first weeks were exhausting and overwhelming in ways Adelaide had not anticipated. She was healing from the birth, learning to nurse, adjusting to the constant demands of a newborn who needed her every few hours around the clock. Russell helped as much as he could, walking Robbie when he fussed, changing diapers with fumbling inexperience, bringing Adelaide food and water and anything else she needed. But he also had to return to work, and Adelaide found herself alone in the cabin for long stretches, responsible for this tiny helpless being who depended on her for everything. There were moments of doubt, times when Adelaide wondered if she was doing anything right, if Robbie would survive her inexperience and mistakes. But there were also moments of transcendent joy, when Robbie would look up at her with his blue eyes and seem to recognize her, when he would fall asleep on her chest with tiny snuffling breaths, when Russell would come home and scoop up his son with such obvious love that Adelaide's heart felt too large for her body. They found their rhythm eventually, settling into the patterns of life with an infant. Robbie grew and changed daily, becoming more alert and responsive, beginning to smile and coo and reach for the things that caught his attention. Adelaide's sewing work had ceased entirely during the last months of pregnancy and the first months after Robbie's birth. But gradually, she began to pick it up again, working in short stretches when the baby slept, finding that she had missed the creative outlet more than she realized. The seasons turned. Robbie learned to roll over, then to sit up, then to crawl with determined speed across the cabin floor. Adelaide and Russell marveled at every milestone, took pride in every small accomplishment, worried over every minor illness or setback. They were learning to be parents together, making mistakes and celebrating successes, growing into their new roles with the same partnership that had defined their relationship from the beginning. On their first wedding anniversary, Russell arranged for Martha to watch Robbie for an afternoon, and he took Adelaide back to their spot by the river. The day was warm and golden, early September at its finest, and they sat on the grass with their hands intertwined and watched the water flow past. "1 year ago today, I married the most extraordinary woman I have ever known," Russell said. "And this year has been the hardest and the best year of my life. Being your husband, being Robbie's father, it is more than I ever thought I would have." "I never imagined this," Adelaide said honestly. "When I was traveling to Snake River last year, if someone had told me that within months I would be married to a cowboy and living on a ranch and about to become a mother, I would have thought they were insane. But Russell, I would not change a single moment of it. This life we have built together, it is everything I never knew I wanted." "Here is to many more years," Russell said, kissing her softly. "Many more anniversaries and adventures and everything else that comes with stitching our lives together." They made love that afternoon on the riverbank, slowly and tenderly, relearning each other after the long months when Adelaide's body had been focused on pregnancy, and then on nursing their son. It was different than before. Adelaide's body changed by childbirth, but no less sweet, no less full of love and connection. Afterward they lay in the grass and talked about the future, about the children they hoped to have, about the expansions they wanted to make to the cabin, about growing old together in this place they had made their home. Life continued its forward momentum. Robbie took his first steps just before his first birthday, falling and getting back up with determined persistence that reminded Adelaide of his father. Russell was promoted to full partner in Elkhorn Ranch, recognition of his years of dedication and the success of the operation under his leadership. Adelaide's sewing business picked up again as Robbie became more independent, and she found she enjoyed the balance of work and motherhood, the way each role fed different parts of herself. When Robbie was 18 months old, Adelaide became pregnant again. This time, the news came with less shock and more quiet happiness, a sense of their family continuing to grow and evolve. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Adelaide knew what to expect, and she worked almost until the end, creating a wedding dress for a rancher's daughter and a suit for the new schoolteacher who had arrived in Snake River that fall. Their daughter was born in April, during a soft spring rain that seemed like a blessing after the harsh winter. The labor was shorter this time, and when Mrs. Chen placed the baby in Adelaide's arms, Adelaide looked down at her daughter's tiny, perfect face and felt her heart expand yet again, making room for this new love. They named her Emma, and she was different from Robbie from the start, more demanding and particular, with a temper that flared hot and fast when she was displeased. Russell doted on her shamelessly, this fierce little girl who had wrapped him around her finger from her first breath. Robbie was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to hold her and touch her and bring her toys, and Adelaide spent much of her time managing his enthusiastic helpfulness while nursing Emma and trying to keep the household running. It was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. The cabin, which had once seemed spacious enough for two, now felt crowded with 2 adults and 2 children, and Russell began planning a major addition, a second story that would give them more room to grow. Money was not abundant, but it was steady, between Russell's partnership income and Adelaide's sewing work, and they could afford the materials even if Russell had to do most of the labor himself. The summer Robbie turned 3 and Emma was 14 months old, Russell began building the addition in earnest. He worked every spare moment, often into the evening by lamplight, determined to have the new space finished before winter. Adelaide helped when she could, holding boards steady or fetching tools, the children playing nearby under Martha's watchful eye when she came to visit. It was during this time that Adelaide realized how deeply her life had changed from those early days when she had been traveling alone to Snake River, all her belongings in a carpet bag and $17 in her pocket. She had a husband who loved her, children who depended on her, a home she had helped create, a community where she belonged. She had stitched herself into the fabric of this place, and it had stitched itself into her, and the pattern they had created together was more beautiful than anything she could have imagined. One evening, after the children were asleep and Russell had finally put down his tools for the day, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains. Russell's arm was around Adelaide's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, content, and tired in equal measure. "Do you ever regret it?" Russell asked quietly. "Giving up your independence, tying yourself to this life?" Adelaide was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "I thought independence was what I wanted, what I needed to be happy. But what I really needed was to matter to someone, to be part of something bigger than myself. You gave me that, Russell. You gave me a place to belong. You gave me the same thing," Russell said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was just going through the motions before you came along. You made me want to build something that would last, to create a legacy. Everything I do now, I do for you and for our children. You are my purpose, Adelaide." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. The same stars that had witnessed their wedding night, that had watched over their growing family, that would continue to shine long after they were gone. Adelaide thought about the story she would tell her children someday, about the seamstress who was traveling to Snake River, and the cowboy who had saved her from robbers, and then convinced her to stitch her life with his. It sounded like something from a dime novel, too romantic to be real, but here she was living it, breathing it, building it stitch by stitch and day by day. The years flowed past with the relentless momentum of river water. Robbie grew into a sturdy, serious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the skills of ranching with eager intensity. Emma remained fierce and fearless, climbing trees and riding horses almost before she could walk properly, giving Adelaide gray hairs with her adventures. When Emma was 2, Adelaide gave birth to another son whom they named Daniel, and 2 years after that came another daughter, Sarah, completing their family of 6. The cabin had grown with them, expanding upward and outward until it was a proper house with multiple bedrooms, a large kitchen, a parlor where Adelaide could receive her sewing customers. Russell and Mr. Patterson had prospered together, and Elkhorn Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the territory. They hired more hands, expanded their herds, purchased additional land. Russell had proven his worth 1,000 times over, and Mr. Patterson had begun talking about retirement, about leaving the ranch in Russell's capable hands when the time came. Adelaide's sewing business had evolved as well. She no longer took every commission that came her way, but instead focused on more complex and lucrative projects. Wedding dresses and suits, custom clothing for the wealthier families in the region, specialty items that showcased her exceptional skill. She had trained 2 young women as assistants, teaching them the trade just as she had once learned it herself, creating a small enterprise that supported several families. Through it all, through the challenges and changes, the joys and sorrows of raising 4 children and building a life together, Adelaide and Russell's love had only deepened. They had learned each other's rhythms and patterns, had weathered disagreements and hardships, had celebrated triumphs and mourned losses. They knew how to communicate in glances across a crowded room, knew when the other needed space or comfort or simply silent companionship. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Russell took Adelaide back to Snake River, to the hotel where their wedding reception had been held. The children stayed with the Pattersons, who by now were like grandparents to them, and Adelaide and Russell had a rare night alone together. They dressed in their finest clothes. Adelaide in a new dress she had sewn from fabric that reminded her of the blue cotton Russell had given her so long ago, and Russell in a suit that made him look distinguished and handsome. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing, about their children and the ranch and the life they had built. Russell held Adelaide's hand across the table and looked at her with the same intensity he had brought to their courtship, as if she were still the most fascinating person in the world. 10 years, he marveled. A decade since you walked into my life and changed everything. Adelaide, you are even more beautiful now than you were then. You are even more extraordinary. Every year with you has been a gift. You are the one who is extraordinary, Adelaide said, her throat tight with emotion. You saw me, Russell, when I was just a seamstress traveling through. You saw something worth fighting for, worth building a life around. You gave me everything I never knew I needed. We gave each other everything, Russell corrected gently. That is what partnership means. That is what love means. They danced that night, swaying slowly to music from the hotel's piano, holding each other close and remembering their wedding, remembering all the moments that had led them here. When they finally returned to their hotel room, they made love with the practiced ease of a decade together, familiar and passionate and tender, a physical expression of everything they meant to each other. The next morning, they retrieved their children from the ranch and returned to their normal life. But Adelaide carried the memory of that anniversary like a talisman, a reminder of the foundation beneath all the daily chaos and responsibility. No matter how busy life became, no matter what challenges they faced, she and Russell had this between them, this bedrock of love and commitment that nothing could shake. The years continued to pass. Robbie turned 12, then 14, growing tall and strong and taking on more responsibility around the ranch. Emma at 10 was still wild and adventurous, but beginning to show interest in Adelaide's sewing work, sitting beside her mother and learning the basic stitches. Daniel and Sarah were still young, 8 and 6, full of energy and mischief, and the kind of joy that only children possess. Mr. Patterson died peacefully in his sleep when Robbie was 15, and true to his word, he left the ranch to Russell in his will, recognizing him as the son he had never had. Martha stayed on in the main house, unwilling to leave the place that had been her home for 30 years, and Adelaide was grateful for her continued presence and friendship. Russell took on the full responsibility of running Elkhorn Ranch with a mixture of pride and trepidation, determined to honor Mr. Patterson's legacy while putting his own stamp on the operation. It was a lot of work and a lot of pressure, but Russell thrived under it. He hired smart managers, made strategic decisions about herd management and land use, invested in improvements that would pay dividends for years to come. Adelaide supported him in every way she could, managing their household with efficient care, offering advice when he asked for it, providing a sanctuary where he could relax and be himself after long days of responsibility. When Robbie was 17, he told his parents that he wanted to stay on the ranch, to make it his life's work the way Russell had. Russell's pride was obvious, but so was his insistence that Robbie be certain that he not choose this life out of obligation but out of genuine desire. "This is hard work," Russell told his son seriously. "It is rewarding, but it is relentless. If you want to do something else, to go somewhere else, your mother and I will support you completely. Do not choose this because you think it is what I want." "It is what I want," Robbie said firmly, and Adelaide saw Russell in the set of his jaw, the determination in his eyes. "This is home, Dad. This is where I belong. I want to learn from you to build something I can be proud of. I want what you and Mom have, a life that means something." So Robbie stayed, and Russell began teaching him everything he knew, preparing him to eventually take over the ranch when Russell himself was ready to step back. Adelaide watched them work together, father and son united in purpose, and felt profound gratitude for the life they had built, for the legacy they were creating. Emma at 15 surprised everyone by announcing that she wanted to become a teacher. She had always been bright and curious, but Adelaide had assumed her daughter would follow her into sewing or perhaps marriage to a local rancher's son. But Emma had other ideas, and once Adelaide and Russell got past their initial surprise, they supported her wholeheartedly. They made arrangements for Emma to attend normal school in Boise, to pursue the education that would allow her to teach. It was hard to let her go, hard to watch their fierce daughter ride away with her trunk and her dreams, but Adelaide was also proud beyond measure. Emma would have opportunities Adelaide had never had, would be able to make choices based on her own desires rather than necessity. That was what they had worked for, she and Russell, to give their children more options, more chances, more freedom than either of them had known. Daniel and Sarah were still at home, still needing their parents' guidance and care, but Adelaide could feel time speeding up, could sense that the years of active parenting were beginning to wane. It made her both sad and grateful, nostalgic for the chaos of small children while also appreciating the different joys of watching her children become their own people. On their 20th anniversary, Adelaide and Russell took a trip to Boise to visit Emma, who was thriving at school and full of stories about her classes and her friends. They stayed in a proper hotel, saw the growing city, attended a play at the Opera House. It was strange and wonderful to be just the two of them again, to remember who they had been before children and responsibility had filled their days. 20 years, Adelaide said as they sat in their hotel room, looking out over the city lights. "Half my life spent with you. Can you believe it?" "Best 20 years of my life," Russell said, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "And we have many more ahead of us still. We are not old yet, Adelaide. We have time." They did have time, years of it, watching their children grow and marry and start families of their own. Robbie married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, a practical match that was also a love match, and brought his wife to live on Elkhorn Ranch. Emma finished her schooling and took a teaching position in Snake River, eventually marrying the town's doctor and settling into a life that balanced career and family in a way that made Adelaide proud. Daniel studied engineering and moved to Boise, working on the irrigation projects that were transforming Idaho's agriculture. Sarah became a nurse, caring for people with the same fierce determination she had brought to climbing trees as a child. Adelaide and Russell became grandparents, then grandparents many times over, their house filling with visiting children and grandchildren on holidays and special occasions. They watched the 20th century arrive, bringing changes they could not have imagined back in 1878 when Adelaide had first stepped off that stage in Snake River. Automobiles began to appear on the roads, electricity came to the ranch, the world grew smaller and faster and more complex. But through all the changes, through all the years and seasons, Adelaide and Russell's love remained constant. They had built something lasting, something that would outlive them in the legacy of their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that bore the marks of their care and vision, in the community where they had made their mark. When Adelaide was 62 and Russell was 65, they sat on their porch one summer evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their hair was gray now, their bodies slower and stiffer than they had once been, but their hands were still intertwined the same way they had been for 40 years of marriage. "You remember the day we met?" Adelaide asked, though she knew Russell remembered as clearly as she did. "Every detail," Russell confirmed. "You stood there with your sewing basket, telling those robbers that your $17 was everything you owned. I thought you were either the bravest or the most foolish woman I had ever seen." "Both, probably," Adelaide said with a smile. "I was young and scared and trying so hard to be strong. And then you appeared like something out of a story and everything changed." "I knew the moment I saw you," Russell said quietly. "I knew you were going to be important to me. I did not know how or why, but I knew I could not let you just pass through my life. I had to convince you to stay, to give us a chance." "You did not have to work very hard at the convincing," Adelaide admitted. "I was half in love with you before you even brought me that blue fabric. When you asked to call on me, I wanted to say yes so badly it frightened me." "And look at what we built," Russell said, gesturing at the house, the land, the life around them. 4 children, 8 grandchildren so far, a ranch that will provide for generations, a love story that lasted a lifetime. "It is not over yet," Adelaide said firmly. "We still have time, Russell. We still have years together." They did have more years, precious ones filled with the quiet joys of a long marriage and a life well lived. They saw their grandchildren grow, welcomed great-grandchildren, celebrated Robbie taking over full management of the ranch as Russell gradually stepped back. They traveled a little, visited their scattered children, took joy in each other's company and in the memories they had accumulated like treasures. When Russell died at 72, peaceful in his sleep after a full day working on the ranch he loved, Adelaide felt as if part of herself had been torn away. The grief was overwhelming, all-consuming, a physical ache that no amount of comfort from her children could ease. She had known him for 48 years, been married to him for 47, and she did not know how to exist in a world where he was not beside her. But she endured, because that was what they had always done, endured and persisted and built something that would last. She stayed in the house they had created together, surrounded by the evidence of their partnership. She continued her sewing, though her fingers were arthritic now, and the work came slowly. She spent time with her children and grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the cowboy who had saved a seamstress and convinced her to stitch her life with his. Adelaide lived another 8 years after Russell's death, long enough to see the ranch continue to prosper under Robbie's management, long enough to know that what she and Russell had built would endure. When she died at 80, surrounded by her family, her last conscious thoughts were of Russell, of the life they had shared, of the moment when their eyes had met across a dusty road and everything had changed. They buried her beside Russell on a hill overlooking Elkhorn Ranch, with a simple marker that bore both their names and the dates that bracketed their lives. But their real memorial was all around, in the ranch that still bore their mark, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward their legacy, in the stories that were told and retold about the seamstress and the cowboy who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. Their love story became part of Snake River's history, passed down through generations as an example of what dedication and partnership could create. The house they had built together still stood, modified and expanded but fundamentally unchanged, shelter for the family they had founded. The land they had worked still produced and provided, testament to their careful stewardship. But more than any physical legacy, Adelaide and Russell left behind the intangible inheritance of a love that had endured through hardship and joy, through change and constancy, through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a life. They had taken separate threads and woven them together into something stronger than either alone, a pattern of commitment and care that had held firm for nearly 5 decades. Their grandchildren told their own children about how Adelaide and Russell had met, about the stagecoach robbery and the gift of blue fabric, about the courtship and the wedding and the life that followed. The story took on mythic proportions over the years, embellished and romanticized, but at its core remained the simple truth. Two people had found each other, had chosen each other, had built a life together one day and one decision at a time. The blue fabric from Russell's first gift had long since been worn out. Adelaide's wedding dress carefully preserved, but eventually crumbling with age. But the love it represented had proven more durable than any material thing, outlasting cloth and leather and wood, surviving in the hearts and memories of those who came after. On summer evenings, when the light turned golden and the air carried the scent of grass and sage, people claimed they could sometimes see two figures walking hand in hand along the river, a woman with dark hair and a man with a cowboy's confident stride. Whether these were ghosts or tricks of the light or simply the power of a good story, no one could say for certain. But the people of Snake River liked to think that Adelaide and Russell were still there somehow, still together, still watching over the land and the family they had created. Because that was the real ending to their story. Not death or separation, but continuation, legacy. The ripples spreading outward from the choices they had made and the love they had shared. They had stitched their lives together with care and intention, and those stitches had held, creating a pattern that would endure long after they were gone, a testament to what two people could build when they chose to face the world together, when they took separate threads and wove them into something beautiful and lasting and true. The ranch continued through the generations, adapted and changed but fundamentally rooted in the foundation Adelaide and Russell had laid. Their great-great-grandchildren walked the same land, looked out at the same mountains, felt the same sense of belonging and purpose that had driven their ancestors. The story of the seamstress and the cowboy became family mythology, told at reunions and holidays, a reminder of where they had come from and what it meant to commit fully to another person, to build something together that would outlast any individual life.